following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
We are back. Golenbock University, Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tycho, and we have a guest for Peter tonight. He's here, and Joe Casale, new to these airwaves, but an old Facebook friend of mine and a former player agent, and I'm so delighted to have you on the Peter Golenbock Show. Peter, meet Joe Casale.
How do you do, sir? A pleasure.
How are you, Peter?
I'm just fine, actually. Just fine.
Good.
So I'm excited because being a baseball agent is a very complicated and a very, very interesting job. So how long had you been in this business, doing this?
Well, I'll give you a quick background. Baseball was the one sport I didn't do. I had an interesting kind of full circle. I was an agent for 18 years. I had my own firm, and I started representing broadcasters and then branched out to football and tennis players. But when I decided to become an agent, George Grand, former ESPN anchor and the play-by-play voice of the TV voice of the Cincinnati Reds, George was a mentor of mine. And George said, if you're going to get into this business, I'm going to have you meet Marvin Miller. And now we're going back to 1987. Okay. So he arranged a lunch with Marvin. And it was going to be like this 1 hour lunch, and Marvin was basically doing a favor for George. And we started to get into talking, and I think Marvin wanted to figure out whether or not I was someone that had the stomach to handle players and not be infatuated with owners. And what turned out to be a 1 hour conversation became a 3.5 hour conversation. And I always say when I do lectures that I learned more in that 3.5 hours with Marvin than I did in 3 years of law school. I mean,
first of all, where did you go to law school?
University of Bridgeport.
I grew up in Stanford, so I know your neck of the woods. And when you sat down with Marvin, what is it that you wanted from him?
It was basically a roadmap into just the business in general. And I was not, I was always a fan of Marvin's. I always had great respect for him. I've always been a player side guy. And Marvin, I think, sensed that and then wanted to kind of test my toughness. I mean, he had one line that he said to me that I actually wrote about last week. He said, one word of advice I'll give you: you don't join the same country club as management. You're not management, and it was really, and once Marvin sensed, and you have to remember in the late 80s there was a lot of labor strife in the NFL, and it was a situation where there were new agents getting into the business, and really it was one of those periods in the NFL, and in my view they went in the wrong direction, that we could have changed.
Joe, are you talking about the NFL? Are you talking about football now?
Yeah, I'm talking about, because I got into the football side of it. When Marvin spoke
so you're talking to Marvin not just about baseball, but mostly about what it is to be an agent.
Correct.
Okay.
And
so he's giving you advice no matter what the sport is.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, and basically his advice was simple. I mean, you're a player's guy. I mean, it's not about the owners, and you have to do what you need to do in the best interest of your clients, and that's the way it is. And then we had a general talk of labor in sports, and just an overall talk of labor in sports. And because I started on my own. I mean, I started my own business. I wasn't working for someone else. And what ended up happening is it really gave me a roadmap going forward. It made me understand. It's one of those things, you watch somebody from afar, and I always followed the growth of baseball, certainly being a Yankee fan in the 70s and growing up in that environment and seeing that change and seeing what Marvin did in the game and all of that. I mean, that drew me to that. I mean, I wanted to help players in that regard. And I think he sensed that, and then he, basically gave me what I would say a come to Jesus talk of what this business is about and, what you should be expected to do. And it was very helpful. I mean, I never spoke to Marvin again after that conversation.
Well, let me ask you, what is it that he said it was all about?
It was understanding that management and ownership are not your friends, that when push comes to shove, they don't care about the players. The players are just cattle. They are just, they are replaceable parts. And it's up to you to not just build value, but to make sure these guys keep value, keep their money, and keep, and understand the business side of this, because this is just a business. It is not a game. And, it's one thing to conceptualize that in your head. It's another thing when you listen to the guy across the table that you have enormous respect for, who changed the world of sports.
Exactly.
So it's a whole different mindset, and it kind of locked me in to what things I may have had theories about, but it locked me in that, I needed to go on a certain track in order to be successful.
Did he discuss any agents who were, say, in the pocket of management?
He talked about the importance. He didn't mention names, but he talked about the importance of not getting seduced with the life. And so you become a puppet of management. You become someone that management feels they can manipulate. And that was never my personality anyway. I mean, I was always a player side guy. I was one of those people who could recite the Messersmith ruling. Okay. I mean,
understood. But how did he suggest that might happen to somebody who was to become an agent? How does somebody who becomes an agent become in the thrall of these owners? How does that happen?
Well, it happens when you forget why you're there. In my view, I saw that in the football side of it.
You did?
That all of a sudden you start, in a way, treating your clients the way management treats your clients. That they're interchangeable. Okay, I'll get a new guy next year if this guy goes, but this is what I have to do. And it's kind of a rearranging of the deck chairs. And, like I said, I was not involved in the baseball side of it. I saw it a lot in football because the turnover was so massive. You get a situation where, let's say, you represented a second round draft pick who was an offensive lineman in 1 year, and the following year you have a chance to get a first round running back, and you're spending all of your time recruiting that running back because it means more in fees for you, and forgetting about the guy that you worked with last year, and forgetting that guy is telling other people in the locker room about you, good and bad. So it's that kind of thing, and the business has changed obviously in over a 30-year period. I mean, in the 80s, I always used to call it was like the gold rush. Everybody was marking their territories, and you had, and certain people work certain areas. Now it's like Afghanistan. That you don't know who the person next to you is, of whether or not he's a terrorist. The client poaching is just off the chart. The fee structures have been reduced dramatically by player associations, and that has lowered the quality of representation in my mind, and it has brought an element in the business that really has done more to hurt players than help players. And
so did you have
and frankly,
did you have people steal your clients?
I had one. In the years I did it, I had one guy who stole a client from me, and I explained to him the problem that was. He disregarded it. I reinforced that point, and over an 8-year period, he kept the client, and he ended up sending me the fees. And I never had another client stolen from me again. Because he understood that was not the way I play. I never stole clients from other agents, And after that little episode, I never had that problem again. And you have to understand the NFL Players Association, when it comes to agents, is really not as agent friendly as the MLB Players Association was under Marvin and Gene Orza. It's a different world. It's like two different countries. And
how'd you get them to pay you the fees?
Well, I like to think that I'm a very persuasive guy, and I gave him a series of options, and each one descended in good and bad for him, and he was able to understand that I meant business, and we worked things out.
Oh, very good.
Like sometimes, as they say, you have to be a diplomat. So that's kind of how it played out. But it's funny, and then when we look at baseball today. And I wrote about this last week, and what I see is a looming player strike coming up and a work stoppage because of what's happening with the entire compensation system is broken in the game. I mean, the game is an $11 billion industry right now, and players are getting less money, and there's more guys out of work. I mean, I was telling Ralph the story the other day. In 2001, when Alex Rodriguez signed his $251 million deal with the Rangers, baseball was a $3 billion industry. Right. It's now an $11 billion industry, and we're hearing people say that Bryce Harper and Manny Machado shouldn't get big contracts. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
Well, they've been saying that ever since Koufax and Drysdale held out for, $120,000. The fans have always been sort of inveigled by reporters who the sports reporters always, and I mean always, and this goes back to 1885, take the side of management because the reporters need the management, the information from the management far more than they do need the information from the players.
And
there's no question.
Dick Young is a perfect example.
He certainly is.
He ran Tom Seaver out of town. And he was one of my heroes when I was a kid in terms of his ability to get into the locker room, and I think he was the first such reporter and all that. He was terrific. The first thing we'd read in the morning is the Daily News and Dick Young, and I was so disappointed in that. It's akin to what Joe was talking about, falling into bed with management as an agent. This guy did it as a reporter.
Well, understand that this is what this is the deal Dick Young made with Walter O'Malley going back to the 50s. The idea was Walter O'Malley basically said to him, I'll give you the scoops, but when an issue comes up, you will always take my side. And it wasn't said, but it was assumed. And Young always did that. And you saw that with, the worst of it came with the Seaver deal, where, Seaver wanted more money and Dick Young went after him to the extent that Dick Young attacked Tom Seaver's wife. And Seaver
I remember
said,
that.
The hell with it. I don't want to be here anymore. To the detriment of all the New York fans who loved Tom Seaver to death.
He pitted wives. He pitted Nolan Ryan's wife against Tom Seaver's wife.
He did.
And I have, as a fellow podcaster on this network, Skip Lockwood, whose career was totally influenced by Seaver and Ryan. They were teammates in L.A. and what have you. He knows both couples intimately and swears to me there was never any friction between either the players or the wives, or one player and the other person's wife, or that just did not happen, and that was all made up by the press and management.
No, Dick Young made it up. Dick Young invented that. He invented it to cause Seaver to do what he did. because this is what O'Malley basically, it wasn't O'Malley at the time, it was the Mets ownership. It's what who was the general manager at the time? That cranky old guy.
I think it was
M. Donald Grant, right?
M. Donald Grant,
Yes.
exactly. That's who it was. M. Donald Grant, because he had the same deal with M. Donald Grant, which is amazing. And so fans almost always will take the side of the ownership. Oh, the Mets are paying so much money for Tom Seaver. It's utterly absurd is what it is. I mean, why the fans should care whether the guy makes $1 or $20 million is something I've never, ever been able to figure out. But it's something
well, when
that
they're holding the Daily News over a strap on the subway, and going to work for whatever amount of money we mortals make.
That's right.
It affects the fans. No question, the power of the press is there.
No.
Well, I think what's happened is you have two forces that work against it. You now have fantasy sports in which fans associate themselves more as owners than they do as ball players. Growing up, we thought of ourselves as ball players, so we naturally sided with ball players. Now, fans with fantasy sports, they see themselves as owners. So they treat the players the same way owners treat the players. And they don't understand it's all percentages. I wrote a story on this last week. In 1978, the New York Yankees had 34% of their gross revenues go toward payroll. And that was the year, if you remember, they signed Goose Gossage as a free agent. And
$2 million.
The rest of baseball went crazy. Correct.
That's right.
In 2018, the New York Yankees, now a $4 billion corporation, had 31% of their gross revenues go to payroll. It's actually gone down in 40 years. And there's no reason for that. I wrote in the beginning of hot stove season, I said the Yankees should sign both Manny Machado and Bryce Harper because they need both those guys. And people wrote back to me, "You're crazy. Do you know what it will take the luxury tax to?" And I said, why do you care about that? The luxury tax doesn't affect you at all. It doesn't.
Right.
Owners don't. It doesn't affect anything that you do at Yankee Stadium. The fallacy that player payroll affects ticket prices and concession prices has been debunked for 40 years. This is just the cost of doing business. The New York Yankees have the highest ticket prices in Major League Baseball. They can easily afford that. And they also spent 3 years telling the fan base two things. One, we are paring down payroll to get ready for this historic free agent season, and we're going to get younger. And so, and the point that I made in the story I wrote is that when the New York Yankees, George Steinbrenner didn't give a damn about holding the line on anything. He wanted to win. So he wasn't one of the owners that was going to be involved in collusion. Okay? So, but when Hal Steinbrenner decides he's going to be one of the 30 owners, and he's not going to spend this kind of money, the entire sport payroll structure tamps down. And the ball players lose that. Jake Arrieta wrote a tweet the other day that should be on the walls of the MLBPA and every player agent in this business when he said, players 1 to 3 year experience, take a good look because they're coming for you next. And that's exactly what's going on in the business today. Now, there are some baseball writers who are writing about this. And then there are others who don't want to trade their access for and rock the boat, who are coming up with a bunch of excuses. But there is no reason why 2 26-year-old generational players should be told that they can't get long-term deals for large dollars. I mean, it's just
absolutely
absurd.
Right. You're absolutely right.
It makes no sense.
None.
And even in the
there's
analytics,
no reason with their prices being driven down that the Mets don't just jump all over Bryce Harper. He would take them to the World Series. Right.
Let me talk about the Tampa Bay Rays for a moment.
Okay.
They have a payroll right now of $40 million for the entire team. It may be 45 now. They signed Charlie Morton, this fine pitcher from Houston.
Right.
It's the first time the Rays have signed, a star player, maybe ever. And so Charlie Morton adds $15 million a year to their $30 million payroll. So they've got a payroll of $45 million. The team is probably worth $1 billion right now.
Right.
But they pride themselves on keeping the payroll as low as possible because they complain terribly about the attendance. We draw about 15,000 fans per game for whatever reason. But they're about to sign a new TV deal and radio deal, which is going to give them something like, $50 million a year more than what they had before. I scratch my head. I mean, I think they're going to have a very, very good team because they've got very, very good young players to whom they're paying $600,000 a year, $700,000 a year. To have a total payroll of $45 million when one of your players is getting $15 million is not an easy thing to do.
No.
And yet they're always crying poverty. It drives me crazy.
And they're also doing something that while the media calls creative, the whole opener thing, what they're doing is blowing up the starting pitching marketplace. And
of course,
the relief pitching arbitration marketplace. Because if a guy opens 28 games, how is he going to be compensated? He's not going to be compensated like a closer. He's not going to be compensated like a starting pitcher. So it tamps down player salaries some more. The whole
and the starting pitchers aren't going to be awarded because they don't get the wins that they used to get. You can't get a win.
Or the innings.
Yeah.
And that's where I wrote last week and how the payroll system is broken in the sport. Because
where
now,
did this appear? Where did this writing appear?
I wrote it. I wrote it on my Facebook. Well,
why don't you send it to the Sporting News so that the world can read it? I mean, this is something. I'm sure in that it never occurred to me. I suspect it hasn't occurred to many, many people. But what you're saying is absolutely brilliant. You're absolutely right about that.
It is and it has been and it's couched in the analytics revolution. And that's an interesting dynamic because if you, for myself, as a 60-year-old man, if I challenge that, you're old and you don't want to bend with the times, that has nothing to do with it. Analytics is being used to tamp down player payroll and to eliminate the 30 and over player in the game. That's what's going on.
You know what? And that's something I've been talking about for about the last 6 months. You're eliminating the 30-year-old player in the game for a couple reasons. And one of those reasons, of course, is that every single pitcher, including the number 12 pitcher on your staff, throws 95 miles an hour. And so what's happening to those 33, 34, 35-year-olds, with a few exceptions, Cano being one of them, I suspect, or who was the DH for Seattle last year, who's a free agent, who's so fabulous. He's 36 years old himself.
Nelson Cruz.
It's just that the guys who are 35, 36, 34, 35, 36, you're facing, 3 or 4 or 5 guys throwing 95 miles an hour in a ball game, all from a different spot. It's just damn difficult to have any success.
Correct.
Hey, you guys mentioned that analytics is really a tool of management. Bill James, who is working for the Red Sox, he's working in management. And that's just a great example of what Joe was talking about.
Well, I mean, Bill James has been writing these fabulous books since 1985. I've got most of them. But you know, what Joe was talking about with the Tampa Bay Rays and their openers, we had a guy, Yarborough, last year. Yarborough was not a starter. He was not an opener. The guy won 12 games.
Right.
I mean, it's just amazing. And yet I have a sneaky suspicion he's not going to get any $5 million a year because he's not a starter and because he's not a closer.
Right. And that's what the game that's being played. We used to pay for production in the sport. Now we're paying for projection. What we're doing now is we're saying that 23-year-old that we're going to let stay in the majors, and you see this in the catching position throughout baseball. Look at the batting averages of catchers in baseball. I calculated it last year. There were 17 catchers that hit under 200 playing that were on major league rosters. And they're not all Molinas defensively. All of this pitch framing, and they're all great arms. They're not all Molinas. Okay? This is, we're going to keep some young guys. I mean, 2 years ago, the San Diego Padres took Lourdes Torrens in the Rule 5 draft from the Yankees, who was playing in Staten Island. Right. They had to keep him, and they kept him on the major league roster for a year. And he went to the minors last year, but he had a year's worth of major league service time under his belt. He was nowhere near being able to play Major League Baseball. So how are you being competitive when you're doing that? And you're paying the projection game and not the production game. And that's what's going on in the sport. I read an unnamed team executive during free agency this year when Ken Rosenthal asked him about the marketplace, the free agent marketplace. And they said, well, you know what? We're not paying for past production. Well, that's interesting. Then how are you planning on compensating players? If you're not paying for their production, then what are you paying for? You're paying for how you project them. And the problem with that theory is you're never wrong. If the player doesn't project the way you want, you just blame the player because your numbers said one thing or another. It makes absolutely no sense. And so you have a sport now in which at least a dozen teams actively tanked last year. You have one team in the Red Sox who were happily paying the luxury tax. Do you think anyone in Boston, Massachusetts cares what John Henry paid in luxury tax last year?
No.
Of course not. Right?
He made over 20 times that by going and winning the World Series.
Exactly. So now we are, when I say ownership is training fans to be concerned about their luxury tax. That just drives me crazy. It makes no sense.
It should.
The New York Yankees are a big market team. They should act like a big market team. Just spend the money. Because if you're going to sign DJ LeMahieu and you're going to pass on Bryce Harper and Manny Machado and you're going to try to sell to your fans, this makes you better, it's a sales pitch that's falling on deaf ears. I mean, you're not going to get a chance to get
Machado
guys
more than they need Bryce Harper.
Well, they had Didi Gregorius, who they know is going to come back next year, and so part of what their problem is they don't want to have two of these guys next year, which is kind of ridiculous. Understand something about the Steinbrenner boys, Hank and Hal. These are two abused children. These are two people who could not stand being within 100 miles of their old man. They hated him. They hated this guy. And what makes you think that they know what they're doing? There's no reason why they should. I mean, one of them was in the horse racing business for all those years because he didn't want to be anywhere near Yankee Stadium.
That's right.
These are the two guys who are now running the Yankees, trying to do things their own way. It's sort of interesting. George Steinbrenner in 30 years.
The other side of the city at the Wilpons.
George Steinbrenner for 30 years, if he had not been suspended from baseball twice, never would have won a pennant. Never.
That's right, because
the guy was a lunatic. He was suspended 2 times. He was suspended for Watergate transgressions, giving money to the Nixon campaign, and during the 2 years that he was suspended, Gabe Paul built that team into a championship team. Fast forward 20 years later, he gave some lunatic $40,000 or $50,000, Howie Spira, for information to smear his best player, Dave Winfield. And he was suspended for 2 years for that. And during those 2 years, the Yankees kept Derek Jeter, they kept Bernie Williams, they kept Andy Pettitte, they kept the catcher that they had at the time who was so wonderful, Posada, and they kept, more important than anybody else, they kept Mo, who Steinbrenner wanted to get rid of, because he didn't think he was any good.
Well,
so
you know, the 2 famous stories in that was what Steinbrenner wanted to, after Tony Fernandez broke his arm in spring training. Steinbrenner in 1996, Steinbrenner didn't believe Joe Torre and Bob Watson when they said Derek Jeter can play shortstop. He wanted to trade Mariano to Seattle for Felix Vermin. And they talked him out of it. Can you imagine how the course of history would have changed there?
Well, without a doubt. And the only reason they kept him is because at that point, or shortly thereafter, he was suspended for 2 years. And Stick Michael, who was a wonderful, wonderful person and a great judge of talent, got these guys playing on the team. So by the time Steinbrenner came back, it was too late for him to get rid of them. Because what he did for 30 years, what Steinbrenner did for 30 years was to trade their young kids, Willie McGee, et cetera. What was that great Seinfeld routine where George was supposed to be dead? And the father, the father says to Steinbrenner, "Why in the world did you trade Jay Buhner?"
You're right.
I mean, this is just what the guy did. And if he hadn't been suspended twice, he never would have won a single World Series. Never, not one. And so, what makes you think that his sons are any better?
My favorite Gene Michael story about dealing with George came to with Bernie Williams. George wanted to trade Bernie Williams in the worst way.
Yep.
And he one day went into Gene Michael's office after Bernie had, a bad game, and he said, "You're trading him. I want you to call every single team, and you're trading him." And at that time with the Yankees, they had a call log, and whoever calls that were made, George would look at the logbook. So Gene called Stick called every team in baseball, every general manager in baseball, and just said, "Hey, hi, how are you? What's going on?" So he could log in the call. So he goes into George's office the next day with his call log. He said, "See, I called every team. Nobody wants him." And Steinbrenner looked at him and said, "I told you he stinks."
That's so great. That is just a great story.
And he never traded him. And the history.
I picture the
went.
inside of the Yankee front office as the same as being on the inside of the White House today under Trump.
No. The White House under Trump is far worse, because Steinbrenner always had very good people working for him. The problem that Steinbrenner had, something like Trump, was that Steinbrenner always thought he was smarter than the wonderful people who were working for him. Why did he get rid of Billy Martin 5 times? Because every time he'd fire him, he'd say to himself, "I've got to get the best available manager to replace the guy I got," and 5 times that was Billy.
Right.
That's right.
I mean, Trump's a lunatic. Trump's a lunatic the same way George was a lunatic. Exactly the same way. Both these guys think they're smarter than everybody else, and they're not.
Yeah. Well, things have digressed so badly in the White House situation now that he's doing treasonous. He did treasonous things.
He's been doing treasonous things since the day he was in office. Please, he hasn't been. He's been doing it since the day he came in office. He and Putin have been conspiring to do the things they were doing, and let's not talk about that. It just infuriates me. I'm curious about Joe and some of the other people that he knew. This is just terrific.
Well, I'll tell you what's terrific. Joe has a nephew who was the first round draft choice. What was it? The Pirates, right?
Pirates in 2009.
What's his name?
Tony Sanchez. He's a catcher. He's currently a free agent. And it's kind of how I got into baseball, helping manage him and seeing the landscape. And, it's changed. I mean, Tony had his best year as a pro last year in Round Rock in AAA.
Right.
He had 300, he had 1 error, 2 pass balls, 850 OPS, and he's still a free agent because he turned 30. Because he turned 30.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
Right.
And he's a catcher. It's crazy.
Yep.
So you have general managers say, hell, we love the kid. If he's 25, we sign him. And I go, but you don't have any catchers. Yeah, but we have these guys we're projecting to be good, but they haven't.
I hear it. I hear exactly what you're saying, because it used to be that nobody would sign a player who was older than 20. A guy could be 21 and 22 and just be, coming from Cuba or coming from Venezuela or someplace like that. The guys used to make up, change their birth dates so that they would be younger than 21. They did it all the time.
Right.
And it was nuts. It was absolutely crazy. So you've got
There was a baseball expression. They say, "What's your real age? What's your age? And what's your baseball age?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
This thing about being 30-year-olds. I mean, you can see the list of free agents right now.
That's right.
And these guys are not going to be signing for a lot of money. Nobody wants them. The Tampa Bay Rays right now have a team. I think they've got 3 players over the age of 28, and Charlie Morton's one of them. And that's it. Almost everybody they have is 23, 24, 25, and they may very well win the pennant this year, even though everybody's talking about Boston and the Yankees. We had a guy last year, Jake Bowers. They had Jake Bowers. Jake Bowers was either 21 or 22 years old, and they planted this kid at first base, and this kid hit 170. This kid couldn't hit to save his friggin' life, and they played him all year long.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there going, what in the world is this nuttiness? Why isn't this kid back in AAA where he can learn how to hit? And at the end of the season, they traded him to Seattle. And who knows if he'll ever be any good? He may never, ever be any good ever again.
And then what happens is he gets a year of service time in. And let's say he gets a second year of service time. Then teams start saying, hey, we don't want to get the guy in the third year because then he's arbitration eligible.
Exactly.
And so this is what's going on throughout the sport. And, the Players Association, unlike under Marvin, who they were always ahead of the curve, not ahead of the curve here. And they're falling behind. And they're getting caught up.
Understand something. Marvin Miller was the smartest person in the history of baseball. Marvin Miller was smarter than every owner. He was smarter than that moron who was the commissioner, Bowie Kuhn. He was the smartest. He was the smartest person.
Than Branch Rickey, was he?
He was smarter than Branch Rickey. He was smarter than everybody. He was maybe the smartest person I ever had a conversation with. And not only that, he was absolutely freaking tough as nails.
Oh, yeah.
He was furious. He was furious when Orza and those other guys gave in to the players by allowing them to be drug tested. He was furious because he knew the repercussions of that. And he was right.
Oh, yeah. And he was
absolute. He was right.
We went through this in football, and I even lecture about this. When we talk about drug testing in sports, there is only one way it works, and that's confidentiality. And when confidentiality gets blown out of the water, you don't have a drug testing program. And
that's
Major League Baseball, one of the things that galls me about Major League Baseball is that all of the players are painted with the PED brush. Marvin Miller's not in the Hall of Fame, and Bud Selig is. Now, how in the hell does that happen? The guy
because of politics.
Over the industry gets a free pass by the media. And he got a free pass by the media because Bud called them by their first names and made them feel part of the club and made them feel
exactly
chummy.
right.
And Marvin was not about that. And one of the things that's a problem today, and I talk about this with young agents when they call me and they ask me for advice. I say, look, This isn't about being popular on social media. This isn't about being popular with the media. This is about doing what's right for your clients. And what's right for your clients isn't the most popular thing now. Because we have devalued unions in this country. That's a whole other conversation.
That's a whole other
subject. What's happened in sports and what's happened with the Players Association in football and baseball, in their last collective bargaining agreements, they traded comfort over money and they got bulldozed. Yep. You know, the NFL, it's great. You practice less than you did before, wiped out the middle class. Major League Baseball, got more off days. You all have to stay in Ritz-Carltons now. Wonderful. Guess what? You turn 28, 29, you're getting wiped off the planet.
That's
31 or 32,
you're dead.
Telling me a guy like Neil Walker cannot play in the majors? He's a productive player. Not a great player, but you know what? He's a productive player. Can't get a job.
Nope.
It's
I know it.
So
it's crazy.
You traded in comfort for money, and the owners smelled it, and they nailed you. Now, you have no choice but to have a work stoppage after 21. Because if you don't in baseball, the entire payroll system is going to go out the window, especially if openers become a thing, because starting pitching will go out the window. Because
I don't think openers are going to become a thing. 2 or 3 teams will do it, but I don't think everybody will. I really don't. You really have to be of that mind.
Oakland did it last year, and they were.
Oh, I know they did. I'm saying there are 4 or 5 teams that will, but I don't think everybody will. I really don't. But let me tell you something. Nobody can do what Marvin Miller did. Once Marvin Miller died, the players were at the mercy of the people who took that role after him. Absolutely at their mercy, and it will continue to be that way. It will. Meanwhile, it is time for this guy to say goodnight. Joe, let's do this again. I was fascinated by this conversation. I'm really thrilled.
It's a pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. And
Ralphie?
Yeah, Ralphie, have yourself a great week.
Both of you do the same. And
all right.
We'll do it again next week, same time, same bat station. And Joe will be back soon.
I hope so. Very good. Thank you so much.
Take
care. Bye-bye.
You too.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. I'm Ralph Tycho and Peter Golenbock and Joe Casale. This was Cool Beans. Adios, everybody.
Jesus Christ, what the hell's going on? This fucking thing.
The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.